The evening of May 19th in the year 1483 arrived with a fine mist of rain drifting over London. The city moved in uneasy silence as two figures stepped out of the royal carriage, each one still small enough that the crown felt more like a story than a destiny. Edward V, 12 years old, carried himself with the quiet composure of a child who had learned too early what responsibility meant. Beside him walked his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, only 9, his hand gripping Edward's with a desperation he tried to hide. They were led toward the Tower of London, a place that was officially described as a safe residence for future kings. Yet the crowd that gathered along the stone path did not cheer. They watched with lowered voices and anxious faces as the boys crossed under the archway. The rain clung to their hair and sleeves. The sky pressed down on the fortress like an omen that no one dared interpret aloud. Edward V glanced back once. Behind him, the city stretched out in gray layers of rooftops and chimneys, the world he had known growing smaller with every step. Richard of Shrewsbury leaned closer, asking softly whether their mother would come for them soon. Edward pressed his lips together. He had received the same assurances as everyone else, but even at 12 he understood when promises were made of air. The gates of the tower shut behind them, the iron groaning as it settled into place. The sound rolled across the courtyard in a deep echo that seemed to linger long after the metal stopped moving. Servants bowed as the boys passed, but none met their eyes. Torches flickered against the stone corridors, throwing tall shadows that swallowed the children whole. When Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury reached the upper chambers assigned to them, the keeper of the keys closed the door with a slow and deliberate turn. The click traveled across the hall like a sentence spoken without words. If you wish to follow the forgotten truths buried inside royal walls, remember to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter that history tried to silence. The first nights inside the tower passed quietly, almost gently, as if the stone walls were waiting to see whether the two young princes would understand what had begun. Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury woke to the heavy stillness of a place that did not breathe like a palace. The air felt older and thicker, carrying the weight of lives that had passed through before them. Their chambers were furnished well enough, yet nothing in the room felt meant for children. Everything was too still, too polished, too watchful. At first, the routines appeared harmless. Meals arrived at regular hours, though the servants who brought them did not speak unless spoken to. The boys were escorted to the inner courtyard for brief walks. But each day, the walks grew shorter and the number of guards grew larger. Edward noticed the changes before Richard did. A familiar guard replaced by an unfamiliar one. A corridor that had once been open now locked behind them. A door that used to creak, now oiled silent by hands they had never seen. Richard remained hopeful during those early days. He asked Edward about their coronation robes and how long they would stay. Edward answered in the softest voice he could manage, but his thoughts were already shifting. He remembered the silence of the servants when they arrived. He remembered the way the keeper of the keys avoided looking into his eyes. Small details gathered inside him, like ripples on a pond, widening into an understanding he did not want to reach. Inside the tower, the sounds of life were different. The echo of boots on stone seemed to arrive from faraway places. Voices drifted through the walls, then faded as if swallowed by the corridors themselves. At times the boys heard bells from the city, but distant and muffled, like memories rather than reality. The world outside continued, yet inside the tower time felt suspended. Days folded into each other, marked only by the thin slice of light that filtered through the narrow window near their beds. Edward V began to notice that their letters were never taken. He had written to their mother, to the council, to anyone who might answer. He placed the folded messages on the table as instructed, and each evening they vanished. Yet no reply ever came. Richard asked why the replies were taking so long. Edward told him that perhaps the roads were muddy from the rain. He said it with a steady voice, though his chest tightened each time he said it. As the days passed, their world shrank. First, the courtyard walks were limited to a few minutes, then they stopped altogether. The guards no longer spoke to each other when the boys approached. Their eyes shifted away, fixed on the floor or the torches or the ceiling. Edward noticed how they carried themselves with rigid shoulders and tightened mouths, as if they had been given orders they did not wish to follow. At night, the tower grew colder. The boys listened to the wind slip through the cracks in the stone. Sometimes they heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping outside their door before moving on. Richard often asked who it was. Edward answered that it was only the changing of the guard, though even he did not believe his own words. The days became quiet in a way that no royal residence should ever feel. There were no tutors, no familiar faces, no sounds of preparation for a coronation. Only the weight of stone, the careful movements of the guards, and the soft breathing of two children waiting for a future that no longer approached. The tower had been given a new purpose, and though neither Edward nor Richard could name it yet, both of them felt its shape closing in. The days inside the tower did not end so much as fade, sliding from one into the next with a quietness that felt unnatural. Edward V sensed the shift not through locked doors or guarded hallways, but through something far more subtle. The tower had begun to shape their habits, bending their lives into patterns that suited its will rather than their own. It happened slowly. It happened without announcement. Yet it happened all the same. The boys no longer rose with the cheerful certainty of children. Edward woke first now, not because he chose to, but because his sleep had grown restless. He often opened his eyes before the sky brightened, listening to Richard breathe in the stillness. There had been a time when Richard spoke in his sleep, murmuring the names of dogs, horses, and friends. Inside the tower, his dreams changed. He no longer spoke aloud. He only stirred with small movements, as if his mind drifted through places he could not reach while awake. Their daily rhythm narrowed into brief tasks that held no purpose. The books placed at the edge of their chamber remained closed more often than open. Edward tried reading at first, but the words refused to settle in his mind. They floated like dust motes in a sunbeam, visible yet impossible to hold. Richard attempted to continue their lessons on his slate, copying the letters he had learned from tutors long before. The chalk snapped frequently in his hands. His writing grew smaller with each passing day. The most telling change appeared in the way they spoke to each other. Richard, once full of questions, began to choose his words carefully. There was a new weight behind every sentence, as if he feared that asking too much might shatter whatever fragile balance kept them safe. Edward answered gently, though the truth pressed on him more firmly with each conversation. Their voices, once lively and bright, grew soft and measured, the way voices do when two people are trying not to wake something sleeping in the dark. The tower influenced their senses as well. Sounds that once blended into the background now struck them with sharp clarity. A broom dragged along the lower corridor, a kettle placed on stone. Even the flutter of a bird's wings outside the window startled them. These noises reminded them of life elsewhere, life continuing without them, life that once wrapped them in familiarity. The contrast drew a quiet ache into their chests. Richard began to notice new things too. He pointed out that the servants no longer lingered even for a heartbeat. A tray was placed on the table, then carried away without a glance. A garment laid beside the bed with movements practiced to avoid contact. Edward watched these moments with growing understanding. The tower had not imprisoned them with chains. It had imprisoned them with absence. The window, once a small comfort, offered little now. The view beyond it changed with the weather, yet it never seemed to include anything warm. Pale mornings, gray afternoons. Even the evening light carried a coldness that clung to the stone. Edward and Richard stood there often, not to look outward, but to steady themselves. The frost that formed along the edges each dawn mirrored the chill settling quietly in their hearts. Childhood still lived within them, but each day it retreated a little further, leaving behind two young princes learning the truth that the tower revealed without words. They were no longer waiting for a ceremony. They were waiting for something else, something neither of them dared to speak aloud. Outside the tower, the world moved with a speed the princes could no longer feel. While their days thickened into quiet uncertainty, London stirred with rumors that drifted from taverns to marketplaces and climbed the steps of every church. People spoke in low voices, cautious but restless, for the absence of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury had begun to weigh heavily on the city. The coronation that the boys had been promised never came. Instead, a different ceremony took shape in the great halls of Westminster. Councillors who once swore loyalty to Edward V now gathered around his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Documents were debated behind closed doors, and testimonies appeared from men few had heard of before. They claimed that the marriage of the late king had been invalid. They argued that Edward V was not the rightful heir. Within weeks, the path to the throne shifted quietly and irrevocably. The news reached the people before it reached the princes. On the morning Richard III was proclaimed king, a murmur ran through London as though the city itself flinched. Many felt the change before they understood it. The processions that marked a new reign lacked celebration. The silence of the tower had spilled into the streets, lingering in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Inside the fortress, the signs of change appeared with equal subtlety. A new seal on a letter carried by a guard, a different banner raised above the battlements, the occasional toll of bells drifting through the narrow window. Edward noticed these things with growing clarity. The bells rang for a king, but not for him. Richard of Shrewsbury sensed something unspoken, watching his brother with large, searching eyes. Edward could not bring himself to speak the truth aloud. To do so would make it real. Their isolation deepened as the city accepted its new ruler. The small kindnesses the boys once received faded. The walks they were granted early on did not return. Even the guards who stood outside their chamber shifted more frequently. The faces changed so often that the princes no longer recognized the voices beyond the door. It was as if the tower was rewriting itself around them, removing every trace of the life they once lived. Whispers began to spread through London. Some said the boys were unwell. Others said they had been moved for their safety. But those who lived nearest to the tower watched closely, for they remembered seeing Edward and Richard appear at the narrow window in the early days. As the weeks passed, the window remained empty. No shadows, no movement, no sign of the small faces people had searched for. Rumors gained strength whenever night fell. In the candlelit rooms of noble houses, men and women spoke of conspiracies that curled like smoke. In the dim corners of the streets, citizens exchanged glances filled with worry. The question grew louder, though no one dared speak it in the open. What had become of the rightful heirs of England within the tower? Edward and Richard felt the shift without hearing a single word. They understood it in the way the guards avoided them, in the way messages never arrived, in the way the walls seemed to grow closer each evening. Something irreversible had taken hold beyond the stone, and even at their young age, they sensed that their world was changing in ways no child should ever have to understand. The night arrived without warning. It did not come with storms or bells or alarms. It came quietly, settling over the tower with a stillness that felt unnatural even for a place built from stone and secrecy. Edward V sensed the change before anything happened. The air in their chamber felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Richard of Shrewsbury stayed close to him, his small hand clutching the edge of Edward's sleeve. Outside their door, the usual rhythm of footsteps shifted. They were slower, heavier, measured in a way that carried intention rather than routine. Edward listened closely, trying to understand what waited beyond the thick wood. Richard looked toward the narrow window, but even the sky offered no comfort. The light had faded early, leaving only a thin trace of gray pressed against the stone. When the door finally opened, the torches in the hallway cast long shadows across the floor. Several men stepped inside. They were not the guards the boys had grown accustomed to. Their faces held no familiarity, only a rigid seriousness that left no room for kindness. They did not speak. They simply gestured for the boys to rise. Edward placed a steady hand on Richard's shoulder. The younger prince followed him with a quiet obedience born from fear he could no longer hide. The men approached with slow movements. One reached for the candle on the table. Its flame flickered once before being covered by a hand. Darkness wrapped around the room. Richard pressed closer to Edward, his breath quick and uneven. Edward held him with the calmness he wished he truly felt. What followed was not loud. It was a brief sound, a single disturbance that the tower would never confess. After that, silence returned. A silence so complete it seemed to erase the presence of two children who had once carried the hope of a kingdom. By sunrise, the chamber stood empty. The narrow window showed only the pale light of morning. No voices, no movement. No sign that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury had ever stood there at all. Time moved on without mercy. The tower kept its silence. The kingdom adjusted to its new ruler, and the memory of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury thinned into a whisper. Years became decades. Decades deepened into a century. The story of the two lost princes slid into the shadows of London, spoken only by those who still wondered what truth had once lived behind the cold stone walls. By the middle of the 17th century, the tower had changed hands many times. New guards walked the corridors. New prisoners occupied the cells. Yet the building itself carried its secrets without effort. It seemed to hold them the way old trees hold rings, quietly, patiently, without confession. In the year 1674, nearly 191 years after the boys vanished, workers were sent to repair a staircase on the south side of the tower. The structure had grown unstable. Stones had shifted. Wood had weakened. The men arrived with tools and lanterns, expecting nothing more than the usual burden of labor. None of them imagined they would disturb the deepest silence the tower had ever held. While clearing debris beneath the steps, one of the workers struck something unusual. The sound was not the dull thud of wood or the scrape of stone. It was softer, hollow, brittle. When they brushed away the dust, they uncovered a small cavity. Inside it lay two fragile shapes curled close together. Bones, small and pale, resting in a shallow hollow as if placed there with careful hands long ago. The workers fell into stunned quiet. The size alone told them these were not the remains of grown men. These were the bones of children. Two small sets, gathered so closely that it seemed they had clung to one another even in death. The lantern light flickered across the delicate forms, casting shadows that made the scene feel heavier than the air that surrounded it. News of the discovery spread quickly. Officials arrived to examine the remains. Physicians were called to estimate the ages of the children. Their conclusion grew clear with each passing hour. The bones belonged to two young boys, one around 12, one around 9 or 10, ages that matched the princes who had once entered the tower and never emerged. London stirred with a mix of sorrow and unease. People gathered near the gates, speaking in low tones as if afraid to stir the ghosts of the past. Some believed the truth had finally surfaced. Others whispered that the tower itself had chosen the moment to reveal what it had hidden. No official accusation was made. Too much time had passed. Too many hands had held power between 1483 and 1674. The chain of responsibility had dissolved into the fog of history. The remains were placed in a small wooden chest lined with cloth. They were carried in solemn procession to Westminster Abbey, where they were laid to rest among the kings of England. Yet even there, no inscription dared to claim certainty. The bones were honored, but the truth remained untouchable. The tower kept its secrets, just as it always had. The discovery beneath the staircase did not close the story, it only deepened it, reminding the world that history does not forget. It simply waits. Centuries passed, and the tower remained, its walls darkened by rain and soot, its stones worn smooth by time. New kings rose, new wars reshaped the land. London grew broader and brighter. Yet the story of Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury remained like a faint mark on the surface of a mirror, always present no matter how many hands tried to wipe it clean. The discovery of the two small skeletons did not settle the past. It only sharpened the question that had followed England since the summer of 1483. The world wished for certainty, a confession, a document, a final answer that would bind the truth in place. None came. Every record from the era lay tangled in politics and fear. Every witness lived under pressure too heavy to trust. Every rumor carried both possibility and doubt. The boys had vanished so quietly that even the truth had lost its voice. Richard III continued to stand at the center of suspicion. Some believed he orchestrated their disappearance to secure his crown. Others argued that he was the victim of a darker design. A few claimed the princes survived and were smuggled away. None of these stories held firm. They drifted like mist across centuries, changing shape with each retelling. The tower itself became the only witness left. Its windows stared over the Thames with unblinking eyes. Its staircases carried the memory of footsteps long vanished. Its stones absorbed every whisper of betrayal and grief. People who passed through its gates often spoke of a coldness that appeared without wind, as if the place remembered two children who once waited for the world to return for them. At Westminster Abbey, the small wooden chest that held the discovered bones rested beneath quiet arches. Visitors paused before it, with the reverence given to lost royalty. Yet the plaque offered no final truth. It did not name the remains with certainty. It simply acknowledged the weight of what might be. A reminder that history sometimes folds its darkest chapters into silence. The princes never reached their coronation. Their brief lives ended before their story could claim its rightful place. England continued without them, stepping forward on ground shaped by their absence. The crown they were born to inherit passed from hand to hand, its brilliance untouched by the shadows beneath it. Still, the question remains, lingering like a cold breath on ancient stone. What happened in the tower that night when the kingdom slept and two small voices faded forever? If you wish to follow more stories that history has tried to hide, remember to subscribe and step with us into the quiet places where the past still breathes.